Disruptive innovation. It is a phrase or a word that we hear a lot about, particularly in the media, but I think that it would be helpful to walk through a few examples and to talk really about what it is and why it's important. I'd then like to move on to a second topic and talk about why innovation, and in particular disruptive innovation, is so difficult, particularly in the context of large organizations. And then I'd like to finish with a few thoughts on how this can be made a little bit easier. So first, let me tell you a little bit about Innosight. The firm was founded by Clay Christensen, a professor at the Harvard Business School back in the year 2000, shortly after the release of his seminal work, The Innovator's Dilemma, which explored why large organizations seem to fail despite following the best management techniques and practices. Our firm has been around now for about 12, 13 years, and we focus on three primary areas. Strategy, in helping large organizations chart courses through uncertain futures. Acceleration, in which we design, conceive, and launch new ventures in the context of large organizations. And thirdly, what we call capabilities, which is asking and addressing the CEO question of how do I make my company more innovative? And we view this through the lens of a systems problem and work to develop integrated solutions to strengthening the capabilities of organizations to drive repeated and sustainable growth. So let me start by talking about why we must innovate. Now, this chart that I've put on the screen represents the average company lifespan of firms currently in the S&P 500 index. And it's a rolling average, so it includes the last 7 years. And what you should note that, well, firstly, two things. There's a waving approach, these sort of cycles of disruption, and as companies are lasting longer, and then the lifespan is shrinking dramatically. And you'll notice a constant downward trend. And what this means in terms of interpreting it, if we look at the current, the date when this analysis was done, in 2011, the average firm had been in the S&P index for just over 15 years. And if we project that forward just to say 2020, we might reasonably believe that based on the data we have and extrapolating forward, that the average firm will have been in the S&P index for about a period of 20 years, maybe just a little less by 2020. Now, if we just take a step back and consider what that means, it implies a tremendous rate of change, of turnover of firms entering and leaving the index. And it means, in fact, that almost half of the organizations that you currently know and love and trust and do business with are likely to no longer be in the index, and by any measures then arguably growing more irrelevant over time. In fact, the statistics show us that even at the current day and age, the average of about 2 firms are entering and leaving the index on a weekly basis. So this gives us an idea of the order of magnitude of the turnover and highlights the necessity of growing at least at the same rate as the broader market as a whole in order to remain relevant. And this is increasingly a harder and harder challenge as this turmoil increases. Another reason why organizations must innovate is what we call the growth gap. Now, if we look at the left-hand side of this chart, these represent today's revenues. This is the way in which we generate revenues today from the markets in which we operate and using the products and services which we currently are offering to the market. Now, if we look out 3 years, most firms can predict where they will be to a reasonable degree of accuracy. There may be some declines in existing markets with existing products, but these are usually offset by what we would call core types of innovation. And these add to the top line by finding new markets in which to sell products and by bringing to life the products currently in the product pipeline. However, if you look 10 years into the future, it is far harder to predict where those revenues come from. And most organizations have a significant growth gap, particularly public organizations where the inherent value of the stock at any point in time reflects all that is known by the analysts about what that company is going to do in the future. And most analysts and the investors will factor in all the growth that they expect the company to deliver and the growth that they hope the company will deliver, even though the organization may have no idea where that growth is going to come from. It's the challenge of meeting and setting earnings. And so we call this the growth gap. And one interesting thing to note is that this exists in any firm, public or private, where there are expectations from investors for future growth. and it's already factored into the stock price. So the ultimate tool for any leadership team looking to drive up the stock price is to innovate faster than investors expect, and that is how one drives the growth of the stock. And a third reason, and this we might consider a sort of bottom-up approach to thinking about innovation, away from the numbers, and it's that consumer expectations are changing. So whether you are in one industry or another, all consumers, all customers out there are interacting with organizations in new ways. All these organizations on the chart here and hundreds of others are raising the bar in terms of what consumers expect for how they interact with firms, whether it's a graphical user interface, a type of service, a cost, or a way of life. And this bar is constantly being raised, not just by competitors in your industry, but by competitors outside of your industry. And so consumers, and the implication of this is that consumers in your industry will expect you to innovate simply to meet their expectations, which are being reset and constantly challenged by organizations outside of your own industry. So hopefully I've now made the case that innovation is important. So why must we innovate now? This chart I have on the slide here highlights a very simplistic way of looking at the life cycle of an organization. In the early days of formulation, this is the point at which a startup starts to find itself as an organization. It may not yet be profitable. In fact, it may be searching for a scalable business model. As it moves into the exploitation phase, the business model is discovered. You have turned the proverbial hockey stick and are moving up that curve now of growth. And this is the point where the business model is simply a black box into which you can invest $1 and expect a significant return. And then one rides that curve all the way up to the top until a firm reaches the maturation phase, during which growth out of the core business model is no longer easy. Markets are tapped, product pipelines have been expanded, all the features that can be added to a product have been added, and additional growth is now hard to come by. And many organizations enter this plateau of growth where they struggle to work out how they can innovate. Now we can ask ourselves 4 questions. We can ask at each point in the company life cycle, what is the need for new growth beyond the core business? What resources do we have available for this new growth? What are perceptions internally about the need for new growth? And then how can we characterize our attempts at innovation in each of these areas? And in the formulation space in the market, typically there is very low need for new growth because all efforts are focused on finding any growth in the core business model. The perceptions about new growth are there is no time. Organizations are typically burning through capital at this point and trying to work out how they can provide an ROI to investors. And as such, any innovation efforts are all focused on hitting the corner of that hockey stick. During the exploitation phase, when most companies see explosive growth, the need for new growth is now very low because $1 is far better invested from a purely financial return perspective in the core business. Despite the fact of this, the resources available for new growth are actually high at this point. But unfortunately, the perception about new growth is that it is nice but not necessary, because all NPV or ROI-based decisions will lead one to invest an additional $1 in exploiting the core business model. And as such, any innovation efforts that do exist tend to lack discipline and focus during this phase of a company's life cycle. And then finally, we have the paradox occur during the maturation phase, because this is the point at which all of a sudden the need for new growth is high. However, resources at this point are very low because the core business has evolved into an efficient machine which provides high revenues for every employee in the organization. And as such, there's a tremendous opportunity cost to investing those resources elsewhere. The perception about new growth, unfortunately, is that we really should have thought about that 10 years ago. And as such, we tend to find that innovation efforts in these large, mature firms tend to be very impatient. And that can lead to the danger of applying the wrong lenses or metrics to launching new growth initiatives, which ultimately look like another S-curve layered on top of this one. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the difference between invention and innovation. Now that we believe that we need innovation, let us characterize exactly what we mean by it. Now, the 2 gentlemen I have on this slide are Leonardo da Vinci on the left and Thomas Edison on the right. And I've also put up there the quote that innovation is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And I'd like to use these 2 men as examples. Leonardo da Vinci is an inventor. He is most famous for his art, for his concepts, but there's very little that he conceived that was developed and turned into a financially viable product, service, or market. However, Thomas Edison is best known for his invention of the light bulb. And what I'd like to do is take a few minutes to walk through the story behind the invention of the light bulb and make the case that this was true innovation rather than just invention. Now, everybody knows the story that Thomas Edison invented a light bulb, and many may know that there were, in fact, thousands of other inventors toiling away in their own laboratories working on the same problem. But the difference was in how Edison approached that problem. The first thing he did was to realize that he was not actually trying to invent a light bulb, but he was trying to replace kerosene, which was the way of lighting at the time, with a better solution powered by electricity. So he first noted that consumers would ultimately have to switch to a different product or service. And this moved the problem from the realm of a technical challenge into a market or business challenge. As he moved forward, he didn't just invent the light bulb, he in fact invented an entire system which consisted of generators, of distribution, of wiring, and the light bulb was just a part of that overall broader system. The second thing he did was that he conditioned his entire technical research based on some cost analysis. And one of the key parts of this was recognizing that the conventional wisdom of the time being pursued by the other inventors required or suggested that a low resistance filament was the right way to approach the problem, as this would minimize the power lost through heat, wasted heat energy. And he realized, in fact, that copper was going to be incredibly expensive, and if he was to develop an entire system, he would need to minimize the amount of copper in the filament. And this led him to approach the technical challenge from a very different angle, and in fact develop a very high resistance filament. And this led to a very different technical design, a very different light bulb, in fact, the one that we know and increasingly are falling out of love with, to be honest. But it's a very different approach to the problem, basing this on the cost analysis. Another thing he did was he thought very carefully about where he would start. And he chose Wall Street as the ideal place to roll out his first prototypes. And he did this for a number of reasons. He knew that the Wall Street bankers of the age would work late into the evening with smoky kerosene lamps in their small offices in Manhattan. And he knew that they would appreciate a better solution that didn't require them to breathe the kerosene fumes. He also knew that the buildings were incredibly close together and that it would be very easy and feasible to wire up thousands of Wall Street analysts for a fairly low cost, given the way they were densely packed into Manhattan. And arguably most importantly, he knew that this was a group who would provide his seed capital and the political clout to help him defeat the Lamplighters Union, who was clearly quite opposed to any moves to eliminate kerosene from the lighting market. So by working together, combining his business model, his technology, thinking very hard about how he would help customers switch from kerosene to light bulbs, and then thinking about the political and capital implications for building a business, it was the integration of these that made his system work. And I think this is the characteristic of true innovation. All the hard work and sweat, the perspiration from the previous slide that went into thinking through this system, helped him approach the challenge of inventing the light bulb in a very, very different way, and ultimately helped him be successful where others had failed. I'd like now to share another story which starts to highlight the concept of disruption. So this is a sailing ship. This sailing ship operated in the Atlantic area, traveling between New England and the west coast of Ireland, and sometimes France and England. And it operated in the early 19th century. This ship was owned by a shipbuilder who was based in New England. And this shipbuilder served customers up and down the New England coast. And these customers ran textile mills. And they needed ships to help transport the textiles from the New World back to the Old World. And so these ships would run for 4 or 5 weeks, carrying freight from New England back to Ireland. And then on the return journey, they would bring low-cost labor, young Irish women, fleeing Ireland and looking for opportunities and jobs in the New World. Now, I want you to consider the challenges that must have faced the owner of these fleets back in the early 19th century. Their customers were happy. They were running a profitable business that depended on their ability to ship tonnage of materials as fast as possible across the Atlantic Ocean. But at some point, the textile mill owners are competing with each other, and they're looking for faster ways to get more tonnage across the Atlantic. And so one can imagine the meetings that would have taken place as the textile mill owners came to the shipbuilders and said, we need more. How can you innovate to help us achieve our business goals? And one might imagine in the early 19th century, the owner of the shipbuilding fleet realizing that there was a way he could improve his product and better serve his best customers. And it was to move from this wonderful three-masted vessel to unveil his latest innovation, the four-masted sailing ship. The pride of its time, with its tonnage increased from 35 tons up to about 50 tons, and the top speed increased from about 20 knots to 25 knots. So a massive improvement, and the textile mill owners were delighted. And for the next 30 to 40 years, they went away happy, and they had the edge, and they were able to ship more tonnage across the Atlantic Ocean. But one can now imagine the son of the shipbuilder 30 years later, when the textile mill owners are back in the office saying, you know what, this ship you produced, it's great, but all of our competitors now have access to these ships as well. Surely you can help us innovate. Surely there's other things you can do to help us increase the speed and the capacity of your vessels. And you can imagine them scratching their heads and going back to their engineers and saying, how can we deliver more performance? And well, what is performance but more speed and more carrying capacity? And so another 5 years later under development, and the next in line was produced, the wonderful five-masted sailing vessel, a marvel of its time, 80 tons of carrying capacity, with still a top speed maintained at about 25, 26 knots. So as far as performance was concerned, this was a better performing vessel that was better suited to the needs of the best customers in the industry. And one can imagine that another 30 years passed. And once again, the textile mill owners are back in the offices of the shipbuilding company, and now we have the grandson of our original founder in place, once again asking for more performance. And so the grandson looks at the photos of his father and his grandfather on the wall and says, I know what to do. This is how one innovates in the industry. And lo and behold, the Thomas W. Lawson, one of the greatest, largest sailing ships ever constructed, ironically rammed by the very source of its own disruption, a steamship, and the remains of the Thomas R. Lawson now sit underwater in the English Channel. And its fate highlights the disruption that occurred in this industry, which was, of course, the reason why sailing ships are no longer anywhere but the domain of people who like to race them. And if one imagines why the industry did not see this coming, it's quite clear that this technology, this steam technology, was incredibly inferior and simply would not have served the customers of the shipbuilder. Back in the middle of the 19th century, in even early 20th century, as steam technology was being developed, the early boats had tonnages of around 15 tons of capacity, of which 7 to 8 tons had to be used to carry coal. So the effective tonnage was incredibly low. The top speed was minimal, and the range was limited only by the amounts of fuel that could be carried, which unfortunately in the early days meant that these boats had to hug coastlines. In fact, this photo here represents a small steamship that was carrying tourists in the New England region. And so if you had been the shipbuilder and you had seen this technology, there would have been no way you could have used this technology. There would have been no spreadsheet, no financially positive NPV or ROI decision to invest in this type of technology, as there was no customer you had that would use it. Now, interestingly, this technology did find a market. After moving from the tourist markets, it eventually set up shop in the English Channel, carrying simple goods between France and England, cheese and wine, small batches where speed was imperative, particularly for fresh goods like cheese, and it found a profitable market, serving customers who could no longer afford large sailing ships, who needed to fill up all 40, 50 tonnage of their capacity in order to make the run. And this is one of the hallmarks of disruptive innovations, this ability to create profitable markets where large industry incumbents have failed to create profit, and indeed have no incentive to create profit. I'd like to just take that story now and retell it, but through the lens of classical disruptive innovation theory and using a very simple chart. Now, on this chart, I plotted two axes: the performance in an industry, which in the story we've just discussed is the tonnage per unit time, that metric which matters most to the best customers in the industry. And then along the x-axis, we plotted time. And the first chart, or the first line I plotted here, is the performance that customers can utilize or absorb. And what I mean by this is if you imagine an early computer, a 286 or something like that, it would have been impossible to build a much, much faster computer and sell it successfully. Even if someone did have an incredibly fast processor back in the early mid-90s, the market wouldn't have been there for it, because it required so many other things to happen. It required companies to know how to use computers and fit them into their daily processes. It would require software that would actually take advantage of these things. And so over time, the ability of a market to absorb improvements in technology goes up. And that's really the main thing to notice, is that over time, this rises. The other thing to note is, of course, that every market has a distribution curve. There are always customers who will absorb and desire more performance, and there are always customers like my grandmother, who require far less performance out of the market when it comes to processing power. And now I'm going to draw a second line. This is the pace of technological progress, otherwise known as the rate at which companies innovate. And the important thing to note in order to understand the concept of disruption is that this line has a higher gradient than the line which highlights what the customers or market can absorb. And this creates a very interesting circumstances and set of discussions that we can have. Most organizations innovate along this pace of technological progress, up this line, with what we call sustaining innovations. They make small enhancements, sometimes they make big breakthrough leaps, but they're always improving against the dimensions that their customers care most about, and they're always looking to make higher revenues, higher margins from the best customers in the industry, moving towards the top of that distribution curve. And we call these sustaining or core innovations. And when these battles happen, when companies innovate here, typically it's incumbents that win. And what I mean by this is it's very hard for a startup to challenge an industry incumbent along at the high end of this performance dimension. It would have been very hard for someone in the middle of the 90s to come and challenge Intel or AMD in terms of developing processors. This was a battle that was best fought with huge amounts of capital. And any startup that did try to compete would immediately threaten the industry incumbents because they would be going after the best part of the market with the highest margins. And these large incumbents have incredibly large balance sheets and are able to fend off these types of attacks. However, there is another line that we can draw. And what's important to note is that this line starts off lower in the bottom of the curve. So these disruptive innovations are usually inferior in terms of their performance. But over time, they rise up. This is the steamship technology, which initially cannot carry any tonnage and cannot move very quickly, but it does find a way to create profit at the bottom of the market. And then the really interesting thing happens when you consider the point at which the disruptive innovation line intersects with the average performance that customers can utilize or absorb. And this is where the tipping point happens, or the market collapses. This is where the average consumer in the market realizes that they are willing to trade down from all this excess performance that the industry incumbent has created to say, you know what, this disruptive innovation, it hasn't been good enough in the past, but all of a sudden it's now good enough for the average person in the market. And overnight, the markets transform and go through disruption, the industry incumbents collapse, and the disruptive innovators seize the day and seize the middle of the market, relegating the incumbents to move ever up market to focus on the highest end customers or lose the market entirely. And so what is interesting, though, is that in disruptive innovations, it's nearly always the entrants that win. It's the startups. It's the organizations willing to bet on lower performance as defined by the traditional market measures. So that is the story of disruptive innovation, and just a few principles that are worth highlighting before we move on. The first is that disruptive innovations win through simplicity, convenience, accessibility, and affordability. These are the innovations that are inferior. They're often dismissed as toys or an inferior technology when they enter the market, but with this huge asymmetry of motivation, they find ways to move up market and gradually offer better and better products to the middle of the market when they steal the entire market. They tend to focus on important unsatisfied jobs to be done or consumer needs. If you think about why the steamship was successful, it found a core market that had an unmet need that was not able to be served by the industry incumbent. These disruptive innovations provide good enough performance along traditional performance dimensions. They still have to carry goods and have to do them with reasonable speed and tonnage. However, they provide a good enough performance for the rest of the market that really doesn't care about all the features that the incumbents at the high end are developing. And as a result, these types of innovations appeal to what we call overshot customers. These are customers who are no longer willing to pay for the value that the incumbent believes it's creating with additional features. Or they target non-consumers, the people who are simply unable to access, purchase, or otherwise consume the technologies and services offered by the industry incumbents. So that represents the first part of today's story, which is a little bit about why innovation is important and what disruptive innovation really is. I'd now like to move on to the second part of the conversation, which is why is this type of innovation so difficult for large organizations? So the first reason that innovation is hard is that, simply put, what you are good at today constrains what you can be good at in the future. I like to think about business models inside large corporations as flywheels that spin up in terms of their momentum and their size and their speed and their energy. When an organization starts and goes through its formulation phase, it's all about trying to work out how you can profitably scale a business. As you exploit an organization, that flywheel gathers momentum. It starts to become efficient. You invest dollars in building up speed and energy and momentum, and that pays a return. And by the time you reach a mature organization, you now have a finely tuned flywheel, which is incredibly efficient at investing every dollar. However, this flywheel is good at one thing. It spins incredibly quickly and it points in a certain direction. And any time you try to stick something onto that flywheel that represents a threat, that tries to slow it down, or tries to reinvest a dollar elsewhere in a way that might be slightly less efficient, the flywheel creates great friction or even spits off anything that you try to stick to it. Now, I think of this flywheel as three components. There's the customer value proposition. This is the way in which an organization creates value. There's the profit formula, or the way in which a company captures value by offering customers or creating that value. And then there's the way in which it delivers value. These are the key processes and resources inside the organization. And these three parts of the business model work in harmony and drive this engine of the business. And so the reason why it's incredibly hard to innovate is that all the decision-making power rests inside the flywheel. And any opportunity to invest in new innovation, which typically creates a new value proposition, captures value in a different way, or requires a process or resource to work in a different fashion, is at odds with the core efficiency and the nature of the flywheel. And that flywheel is protected by cultural norms, by metrics, by processes, by HR, by technology, and by financial metrics which determine how best to invest dollars to strengthen the speed of the flywheel. And this is the fundamental reason why innovation is hard at large firms. And one of the ways to get out of this is to recognize that all businesses need to consider themselves as a portfolio of different flywheels. These flywheels must be kept separate from each other, or they must be attached onto each other very carefully so that energy can be siphoned from one flywheel onto another flywheel. And by taking a portfolio approach, one considers that over time, new flywheels must be incubated, must be allowed to emerge, and must be protected so that they don't create friction with the core business. Another reason why innovation is hard is that it is always easier to see threats than opportunities. A classic example of this would be Sony, who arguably had the right to be the dominant force in music for far more than one generation. Who here didn't at some point have a Walkman, and that was the way in which everybody listened to music. And like many other brands, Walkman became synonymous with portable music on a cassette player. However, how could it possibly be that all these Sony executives failed to see the iPod and iTunes coming? And I have a couple of suggestions for why this is. There are some great quotes from Sony executives that looked at the technology inherent and said, well, that's not a Sony technology. There was a very strong bias to not invent it here. And as a result, they didn't really want to invest time and effort. They would far rather develop the next evolution of the mini disc or some other proprietary Sony technology. I think another incredibly large reason was that a key part of Sony's revenues came from their Sony Music Group. And the concept of MP3s would have been incredibly threatening to a company that drove a significant part of its margin from selling music through CDs. And all they could see was the threat to their CD business, rather than the opportunities which Apple was then able to capitalize on. So this is the other reason why innovation is incredibly hard, is new technologies tends to be viewed as threats, whereas in fact people see or don't see then all the opportunity that exists outside the threat. As one of my colleagues likes to say, if your lunch is going to get eaten, it's better that you eat it yourself. And the third reason innovation is incredibly hard for large organizations is that it requires a very different type of risk management. Now, everybody in large businesses knows, understands, and breathes risk. But it's the type of risk associated with missing earnings, with missing revenue predictions for a business unit, with not getting the cost structure right. And so these are incremental risks. These are not existential risks. And as one moves out to developing brand new business models, targeting markets where you've never worked, offering services or creating value propositions which you have never considered before, this creates a lot of extra risk. And so what this diagram highlights is that as that risk increases, that risk in fact comes from the fact that you have less knowledge about what it takes to be successful. Now, the flip side of having less knowledge is that you must make more assumptions. And I've loosely assumed here that the sum of a knowledge and assumptions is constant, and therefore as you move out into these more speculative markets, developing very different products and services, of course it's logical that one has to make a number of assumptions. Now, another thing to be aware of is that if you go and survey the average American driver, and this is a poll that's been conducted a number of times, you discover that the average American driver believes, on average, that he is above average at driving. And this highlights one of the fallacies or biases that people have, which is that they are overconfident in their own ability. And in this case, I'm talking about the overconfidence of what one knows and what one has to assume. And so these dotted lines represent how many organizations think about the knowledge they have when they embrace more risk. And what I'm trying to imply here, and this is based on plenty of evidence, is that when organizations launch new ventures, they assume far too much, which they really should have questioned, and they make and don't recognize the assumptions that they're really making. And what that means is if we draw a box over here on the right-hand side and call that our new venture, there are things that we believe we know which we really do know. Unfortunately, there are a lot of things which we believe we know where, in fact, we don't. And on the flip side of that, that means that we are making certain assumptions, what we assume, correctly so, and we are completely ignoring assumptions, the Donald Rumsfeld's known unknowns and unknown unknowns. These ignored assumptions. And one of the greatest challenges that organizations face is being realistic and honest with themselves about the number of assumptions they make, and in fact then reconstructing the entire process to develop and nurture and incubate new growth businesses based on a single underlying assumption, which is we don't know what it takes to be successful. And when one approaches innovation and incubating new opportunities from that underlying perspective, one takes a very different approach to building and executing. And in fact, one leans more towards experimenting and testing and developing hypotheses rather than executing. And we've all seen the challenges that firms that Motorola with its $6 billion satellite network, or Webvan with its $300 million attempt to bring national deliveries, these organizations struggled because they had far too much false confidence. They ignored many critical underlying assumptions in the market, and as a result executed against a business plan where really they should have been running tests and experimenting. So I'm going to move now into the third part of the conversation, which is having described what disruptive innovation is, having talked about why it's so hard, I'm going to leave you with a few suggestions for how it can become a little bit easier. So as I've mentioned, the first trick here is to recognize that innovation is ultimately about allocating resources. It's a fundamental resource allocation problem. And when one considers allocating resources in a financial portfolio, one takes a portfolio approach. And that is the same for incubating and running businesses. one must simultaneously run and establish your core business while attempting to cannibalize or incubate new businesses. And the challenge of a first-rate company is one that can simultaneously manage and handle the resource allocation challenges implicit in this paradigm to be successful. So the first piece of advice I have is around focusing on consumer needs. We use a concept at Innosight called the job to be done. And the job to be done paradigm is one in which we recognize that people do not want to buy quarter-inch drills. What they want are quarter-inch holes. So the way we think about this is that consumers hire solutions when they have a job they want to get done in their lives. And as they have that job to be done and they're in a particular circumstance, they consider all the possible range of solutions which might help them get that job done. And these considerations might be emotional, social, or functional. One of the best stories I've heard that highlights the job to be done story is that of the lowly milkshake. And there's a classical story that asks, why do people hire milkshakes? In related to the question, how does one innovate a milkshake? And researchers discovered that although many companies approach this challenge by pulling obvious innovation levers, reducing the sugar, increasing the viscosity, developing new flavors, none of these were successful. And if one took the approach to actually ask consumers what were the jobs they were trying to get done in their lives when they hired a milkshake, one discovered incredible new opportunities for innovation. And research, in fact, determined that people were hiring milkshakes for a variety of reasons. And one of the main reasons was, in a study we did, was looking at commuters. And commuters would pull in off the interstate and run into fast food restaurants, stand in line, order a milkshake, and then run back out to their cars. And when we asked them what jobs they were trying to get done in their lives, we discovered that milkshakes were competing against the radio, they were competing against bagels, they were competing against apathy, and they were competing against bananas. And these were all the real competitors to milkshakes, rather than a milkshake produced by another chain. And when one understands that the job to be done a milkshake is hired for is related to entertainment or breakfast or boredom during a commute, one can immediately think of all the reasons why people might choose to hire a banana or hire the radio instead of a milkshake. And that provides a different lens through which to view innovation opportunities to strengthen milkshake sales by targeting non-consumers. So that story can be found online at our website or by searching online for milkshakes and innovation. And I'll just highlight a few of the key benefits of taking this jobs perspective, which is that when one thinks about segmenting your market by job, you typically find that the market is much larger. Your share of that market is therefore smaller, which means that the real competitors aren't in your product category, and the growth potential, which is good news, is actually much larger. And most importantly, you understand what keeps a customer from hiring their product for the jobs. And one can imagine if one applied this type of lens while evaluating new technologies and understanding what jobs your customers are really trying to get done in their lives, whether you are the manufacturer of a chip or a sailing ship, one could understand why your solution was being consumed and the barriers that prevented other technologies from being consumed. And I think I can wrap this up with a very simple quote from Peter Drucker, which is that the customer rarely buys what the company thinks it is selling him. So developing a deep understanding and empathy for why your customers hire the solutions that you develop, and thinking expansively about your product category and who the real competitors are is a careful way and a helpful way of making sure that you have disruptors on your radar and can think broadly about taking a portfolio approach to developing a competitive strategy. The second piece I have of advice is to ask why we have a right to win. So let me characterize this with a story of Medtronic and the Healthy Heart for All initiative. So the word of advice that we give large organizations is that you will never compete faster than startups. Most startup employees will be more motivated than you. They will work harder than you. They will have more and better ideas than you if you consider the entire startup ecosystem. And if you try to compete with them by outperforming on whatever topic they've chosen to go after, it is likely that you will fail. So instead, the trick is to compete where you have the advantage. And what I mean by that is to compete in areas where you have a right to win. That means that you have capabilities or assets or resources or processes or relationships which give you unique access to an opportunity. Now, Medtronic, among other things, is well known for its pacemaker business, small implantable devices which help people with chronic heart disease from preventing them from having heart attacks and providing them better care and a better quality of life. Now, Medtronic looked at the India market, where it's been for the past 30 years, and yet has had almost no success in penetrating that market. Mostly because it's tried to take its business model, which is well developed in Western markets, and simply apply it to the Indian market, which meant that they were focused on the very, very highest end, most affluent part of the market, where health insurance was available. However, they took a very different approach and said, we think that we have a right to win in developing the lower end market for pacemakers in these emerging markets. And that was a market where no startup could compete. Medtronic had access to technology, it had a brand, it had relationships with hospitals and medical equipment manufacturers, and so it decided to tackle with a very different approach and a ground-up developed business model that focused on the middle and low end of the market in India, and ultimately now has a thriving and successful business in that market. And this was a market where no startup could have tread. And so Medtronic selected this battle carefully, didn't try to outcompete other organizations, for example, focusing in medical billing or electronic health records in the US, an area where it does play, but instead put a number of resources into really developing this business where it knew that even if it was to achieve success slowly and to struggle along the way, it would find eventual success because it had the right to win in this market. And the third piece of advice I will share is that you have to test and learn in order to manage risk. So we talked a little bit about making assumptions up front. Most organizations, when they launch a new venture or when they're a startup, have some starting point, some initial hypothesis about where they want to go. And so they outline a strategy that says, in 2 years' time, we believe we will have built a platform or a product that achieves some value proposition for some set of consumers, and this is how we're going to do it. And then they embark upon that path. However, there is great data that says that 90% of successful new ventures start off following the wrong strategy. And so, in fact, the only thing that one can be sure of is that your initial strategy is wrong. And so if you spend all your time and money developing against that initial strategy, it's likely that you will soon discover it's wrong, hopefully not after too much time and after too much capital, but by the time you then change direction to move towards the successful strategy, you will hit a wall in terms of your political capital, the actual capital, or the market's patience with the time you've been given to be successful. So it is only those startups or those new ventures that have money and time left over that are able to succeed. There's a great quote from one of our past clients, Scott Cook, which was that for every one of the failures that Intuit had, they had spreadsheets that looked awesome. And this is, of course, the challenge in any large organization, is that the exercise of developing and then iterating and then manipulating spreadsheets in order to pass internal hurdle rates is a well-established game. And this is the way in which organizations convince themselves that they'll be successful, by over-relying and believing early assumptions rather than treating them as hypotheses that must be tested as quickly and cheaply as possible. So a better approach is to think about taking short steps, to outline the assumptions, the hypotheses, to develop a testing plan, and to work out how to quickly and cheaply test the biggest deal-killing assumptions associated with any new business idea. And then, as one looks at the market realities, to reflect upon those and to learn and to adjust the approach. And one can move forwards then over time and iterate towards a successful strategy. There is, in fact, great data that the average successful venture, this would be by a Series C financing, changes business model 4 times before finding success. The Facebook of today looks nothing like the Facebook that initially started back in 2005. The same story for eBay, same story for Groupon. So a quick recap before we wrap up and leave some time for questions. We talked about 3 things today. We first talked about what is disruptive innovation. These are innovations that create entirely new markets or transform existing ones. Disruptive innovations are not technologies, they are business models. They are business models which enable products and services not to be better, faster, stronger, and consumer, but more affordable and more accessible. Often disruptive innovations look like de-featured versions of existing products, and very often they target non-consumers or will pick away the overshot consumers in your market. Disruptive innovation is hard for companies to do. These types of innovations are often a poor fit with your existing business model. If you try to attach them to the flywheel that represents the way in which your company thinks about its business, they will fly off, or they will create incredible friction. Often these new business models require new capabilities and skills, which look very different from the capabilities and skills that the organization currently has. And then thirdly, 3 steps to make innovation a little bit easier. Make sure that you have a ruthless focus on the customer and think about the customer through the lens of how they think about solutions, which will often be through a very different lens than through which the organization thinks about its competitors. As you think about setting strategy and charting a course for where you are going to innovate, ask where you have the right to win. Don't try to outcompete startups faster. Ask where you have the capabilities to dominate a market. And then apply the scientific method to launching and incubating new ventures. Don't place all your bets in one basket. Instead, outline the business model, understand the hypotheses, and then capture and develop testing plans to allow you to go and test and learn and repeat, ultimately pursuing an iterative process towards success, which will minimize the chance of spending a lot of time and money and maximize the chance of being successful. So thank you for your time today. If you have any questions, now is the time to submit them through the chat box at the bottom right. And I'm going to pass the microphone back to Russ and the innovation team to facilitate the questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alasdair, for your wonderful presentation. I'm sure we're all in agreement that it was extremely fascinating, and we thank you for your time. The first question I have is regarding Netflix. In regards to your notion that you should view a company's portfolio as a portfolio of flywheels, Netflix recently made a very public attempt at spinning off their mail order business from their streaming business, in what seemed to be following what you've advocated here as the ideal approach to strategy. In the face of strong customer backlash, however, they were forced to abandon those plans. And the question is, in the face of such strong customer backlash, should they have stayed the course and continue with their plans to separate? Is this an anomaly? Have others that you've seen try to take this flywheel approach face similar type of backlash or are most successful?
Okay.
Lastly, on that notion of Netflix, any thoughts of how they might have otherwise proceeded with this strategy and overcome the customer backlash that they encountered?
So that is a truly great question. I think that Reed Hastings is one of the most strategic CEOs in the industry. And for anyone who hasn't already done so, they just released their shareholders letter. And in my opinion, it's a work of art equal only to Warren Buffett in terms of its simplicity, its prose, and its strategic vision. And I think it is to disruption and strategy what Warren Buffett is to finance. So I'd encourage anyone to read just the first 2-3 pages of Reed Hastings' shareholders letter. It's available on the web. So with respect to the ill-fated Quickster, I think Reed Hastings deeply understands the concepts of disruption. I know he does. And I think he strategically was thinking about how to spin out that business in exactly the right way. You essentially have 2 businesses competing for the homepage. One business which wants to get you to rent DVDs, and the other which wants to stream. And if either one owns the homepage, they would take a very, very different approach to managing that customer experience. And he recognized this conflict, as everyone has known, Reed Hastings has been very public about the fact that he was going to ramp down his DVD business over time. And he has this wonderful chart predicting it out through 2020 and has been sharing that for the last 5 years of his expected decline. So to me, the question is not did he have the right strategy, but did he time it right? And what did the execution look like in terms of did he actually think about his customer's job to be done? And I think that is where he fell short. So through my lens, I believe that he lost sight of the customer for a period of time. And the customer's need is to have a very simple interface, but spinning out Quickster failed to recognize that there were many people who wanted both products and who all of a sudden were going to be forced with maintaining 2 separate lists of favorite movies. And ultimately, there was a massive backlash, and I believe they apparently lost something like 800,000 subscribers. Now, they reverted and have pulled back to the traditional model, but they continue to de-emphasize DVD. I think at some point in the future they will likely try something similar, but they will have been stung by Quickster and will have to be very careful about how they separate out the DVD businesses. But overall, I think it's the archetype of the right way to think about it, but I think the execution left a lot to be desired. And I think Reed Hastings continues to think very strategically about this industry. There's a great quote from him recently about how he views the competition. And for him, it's all about HBO. So he commented recently that it's now a race between Netflix and HBO to meet each other in the middle. HBO has great content but limited distribution. Netflix has incredible distribution and is just starting in the content game. And Reed Hastings will bet, and he tells you this in the first few pages of the shareholder letter, and he respects HBO, that whoever gets to the middle first will win. You need great content and you need great distribution, and he wants to beat HBO to the middle, which is why he's spending 5% of his capital available for movie distributions on things like House of Cards and so on. So there are plenty of other organizations, to the third part of that question, that I think do this very successfully. I would say, let's see, Amazon would be possibly one of the best in class. And if we think about the development of Amazon Web Services, which was initially an internal service developed to help their internal resources get their own jobs done. It was used to support their existing businesses. And then there was a realization that this asset, this capability that they had, would actually offer a value proposition that the market might like. And so they carefully had to start siphoning off this business, siphoning energy, because the internal resources still depended on web services, but they had to carefully scale it up and start offering it in a consumer fashion, or B2B, in a way that didn't hinder their ability to get the job done. And ultimately now it's a standalone business that's growing faster than their core.
Fascinating stuff. Thank you very much. Two quick questions for you. Do you have any examples of how a successful incubator model can work in a services company?
Yes, I think it's incubators, just like corporate VC, has gone in and out of fashion over the years. So I think there are some high-level rules of thumb which help organizations be successful, although there are hundreds of specific incubator models. Those which I think are best in class follow some fairly simple guidelines. So firstly is you have to very carefully manage the separation of this group from the core. So it has to be, what one of my colleagues would say, distinct but linked. If you sit the incubator out in a far-off location, divorced from internal resources, you are starving that incubator of access to the very capabilities that enable this right to win. If you bring it too close, then you risk friction with the flywheel. And that can happen in terms of a number of different ways. But people who are too ingrained in the existing way of doing things, who follow best practices, there are some wonderful books out there on the topics of launching new ventures, and some other folks who work in this field talk about the concept of forget, borrow, learn, which is that that's Chris Trimble and V.G. Govindarajan at the Tuck School. And it's a wonderful framework for thinking about how you must, in an incubator, forget what makes you successful in the core business, borrow only those assets and resources which will enable you to be successful, and set yourself up as a learning organization. I think there are other rules of thumb around ensuring that these incubators are appropriately capitalized, so that they are not given too much capital so that they can conduct themselves like an established P&L, but they must be forced to operate as a scalable learning organization, really looking at stage gate milestones in the same way that a venture capitalist would look at industries. And then a final thought would be they operate using a very strict portfolio approach. So incubation is not about placing one big bet. It's about managing a portfolio of small opportunities which are well aligned with strategy, and ruthlessly killing off those opportunities which are not being successful. Innosight worked for a number of years with Procter & Gamble on their innovation pipeline, and one of their senior leaders there talks a lot about treating the incubator as a series of call options, and one must conduct and decide the fate of small portfolio companies in the incubator as individual call options, and at every point in time one has the option of investing or buying an option on another 60 days of life. And the question is does that merit that investment? Which is a question that has to be addressed in light of the opportunity that's being pursued. So some high-level thoughts and rules of thumb on things that successful incubators do.
One last question for you, and then we'll let you go. in the corporate incubator environment, what types of incentive structures should companies put in place, similar to what we see in startups, to help motivate that type of creativity and innovation that an internal incubation effort hopes to generate?
That's a great question. So I defer to a chap called Daniel Pink on this one, who wrote a wonderful book called Drive. And there's a lot of research on this, and there's TED Talks on similar topics as well for those interested. But the basic premise of that book and these talks is that it is the intrinsic motivators, not the extrinsic or financial motivators, that count. So I have seen and discussed and had clients suggest opportunities which involve, like, creating equity-like structures for people in these types of groups. But the reality is these are incredibly complex, and they actually tend to create the wrong type of incentives. It turns out that the intrinsic motivators, the exposure, the ability to create one's own work environment, the ability to work on great unsolved problems of our time, and to be recognized for one's contributions, these are among the most powerful motivators. And simply offering people who have an aptitude and exhibit the behaviors associated with successful innovation, giving them the chance and the space and the structure in which to do these, but the security of a regular income as opposed to the at-risk compensation of an innovator, it is these tools that make for, I think, successful incubators.